My paper, with its slightly abbreviated title, has, I'm afraid, very little to offer to European history. Instead, it prompted by a rather different question, namely, what are the lessons we may draw from George Mosse's work when studying Jewish-Israeli history? And in particular, I will focus my comments on one book in particular, The Fallen Soldiers, thus paraphrasing the oft-quoted title of Azar Nafsi's famous memoir of pre-revolutionary Iran. My paper is about reading Mosse in Jerusalem. Now, famously, Mosse provided, not only provided new stimulus to the study of European nationalism, but also laid important theoretical foundation to a new sub-branch of cultural history dedicated for the study of commemoration, remembrance culture, and the connection to nationalist, the way it's connected to nationalist history and politics. So the question I would propose here is how Mosse's analysis and his framework might help us reassess the creation of Israel's commemoration culture immediately after the War of 1948. Now, commemoration was an essential element in what Mosse referred to as a new style of mass politics, the historical processes that turned gray history into that amazing heroic melodrama of a secular religion with its own symbolism, rituals, public festivals, and mythologies. So, if you'd like, if for Mosse 20th century nationalism often turned into a secularized religion, its liturgies were often found in the domain of the dead. The language of the nationalist civil religion was inscribed literally on the tombstones of the fallen warriors, on the monuments erected in their memory, and inside and outside graveyards, in the commemoration ceremonies, in the movies, posters, postcards, advertisements, and other cultural artifacts. Now, crucially, the obsessive work of the dead was not read by Mosse as symptomatically, that is, as indications of a society that is suffering from some sort of a post-traumatic stress or a melancholic syndrome, but as actually as historical causes and engines functioning as catalysts in the sacralization of politics and ultimately its brutalization. So soon enough, the commemoration of the fallen soldier became a powerful tool to express angst towards and dissatisfaction from with post-war political compromises. So it became, again, another engine for the nationalization of the masses. So the question I will ask would therefore, if the commemoration of fallen soldiers in the Israeli case had a similar element as a key component of the creation of an Israeli civil religion, did the 1948 war feature in Israel collective psyche in the same way the Great War shaped the politics of France, Britain, and most importantly, Germany? And did the Israeli culture and society develop its own cultural mechanisms for dealing with collective national grief that were modeled after European prototypes, or did they take a different mood and meaning? Now, in a sense, Mosse himself tried to answer these questions in the preface he wrote to the Hebrew translation of his own book. And I will quote a short excerpt from that preface. European traditions are known for having an important influence on the formation of Israel as a state. Moreover, Israel seems to have more war monuments than many other European countries. To these, we must add the numerous military cemeteries and so many memorial ceremonies. But to the best of my knowledge, there are only few war memorials in Israel that can be defined as aggressive, and hardly a single monument can be found with a patriotic oration, as was common in interwar Europe. The mourning here in Israel, even if it's in public, seems to me more personal. Take, for example, the mention of nicknames alongside the official names of the fallen soldiers, which is customary in many monuments in Israel. In Europe, that would have been considered to be detrimental to the sacred character of the monument. What is the difference about the development of national consciousness in Israel? Mosse asks, is Israeli nationalism careful to maintain a liberal nucleus that refuses to imitate the civil religions of European nationalism? ? End of quote. the timing of translation matters. The Hebrew translation appeared in 1990 at a very interesting juncture in Israeli political and intellectual history. These were the years of the First Intifada, before the 1992 elections that brought the Labour Party under Yitzhak Rabin back to power, a time in which Israelis had to come in terms with a reality in which old conventional wars were replaced by a very asymmetrical, unconventional war between a conventional army and rebelling civilian population. The use of force would no longer escaped public scrutiny. Reviewing Mosse's book for Haaretz Literary Supplement, the late novelist Batya Gur speculated, one wonders how such a book would have been received here in Israel before the Lebanon War, a clear hint that after 1982, the Israeli intelligentsia was no longer accepting uncritically claims about self-defense as cover for aggression. But more crucially, it was during the same years that the so-called new historians, that loosely defined school of Israeli historians, such as Benny Morris, Avi Schleim, Ilan Pape, and Tom Segev, began to challenge key aspects of the official state narratives about the past. And in particular, they enjoyed unprecedented access to the declassified documents from the 1948 war that allowed them to question some of the state narratives. And unfortunately, today we see exactly the closure of these archives. A time of a critical self-reflection of the Jewish Israeli liberal intelligentsia, Mosse's book fitted the sensibilities of the age. Commemoration of fallen soldiers, the book suggested, could be easily manipulated and twisted to serve chauvinistic nationalism and sinister ideologies. And interestingly, it was not a predetermined inevitable dynamic, however, and indeed it was very interesting that Mosse found it important to mention in passing, albeit a very really brief comment, but I think it's indicative. He did mention the name of Kathy Kollwitz, the famous German artist who became a pronounced pacifist after her youngest son, Peter, died in battle in October 1914. So, in fact, it was one of those new Israeli historians, Tom Segev, that accompanied George Mosse on a tour to the Israeli cemeteries and other war heritage monuments. And in a longer version of this paper, I can go into detail in showing what are the sites that they visited. Most of them are not connected to the 1948, actually. And this might also explain why, in that preface, Mosse believed that Israeli national commemoration is quintessentially different, not because it's less aggressive, but also because the key message of Mount Herzl, that Mount Herzl radiates and other sites, is of a nation that resurrected from the abysses of the Holocaust. And this is exactly the message of the book that Tom Segev was writing at that year, exactly the 7th Million, that when it came out with in an English translation, it was accompanied by a very nice blurb by George Mosse himself. So if you'd like, making European history a cautionary tale for the Israeli audience, in the prefatory text that Mosse prepared, he was able to, in a way, fashion himself as an internal critic, to use Michael Walter's term, that is, challenging the political authority or the convention and practices of Israeli society without dismissing it altogether, that is, in the name of the values recognized and shared by the same society. But this text also had some very strong a priori fixed ideas about the character of Israeli society and its commemoration practices. I will highlight 3 of them. First, that it forged, as we heard, a more liberal, private, an intimate type of commemoration. Second, that the themes of martyrdom and sacrifice that are ready-made for Christian nations who were undergoing processes of nationalization did not rhyme well with Jewish tradition, cultural tropes, and iconography. And third was Mosse's assumption about certain gender role dynamic that accompanied nationalization of national commemoration. Because commemoration was tied with to performances of masculinity in Mosse's Mosse's world, he found it difficult to imagine women playing a central role in commemoration processes. So it's not surprising that we'll find no women mentioned in Fallen Soldiers, and there's an assumption here that they cannot be seen as actors participating in these rituals because the misuse of memory and the severe ruthless nationalist agenda was a practice of performing manhood. Now, but before moving on and to examine Mosse's interpretive schema, I would like to depart a bit from Mosse's own terminology and typology and suggest identifying at least 5 discernible modes of action that fall under the category that we call commemoration culture. And pardon me for the very ugly academic jargon. So first is what I would call necrography, the production and, when possible, reproduction and dissemination of physical, artistic artifacts, plastic art, the statue or the monument, the photographs, the postcard, the painting, in memory of the dead. Now, collective memory inscribed meaning into these physical artifacts, and they were created to carry the memory to posterity, to serve as artifacts for afterlife. Next, connected to the visual artifact, but different for them, is necrogeography, the place of the dead. In the context of modern war, the battlefield, the actual place of death, and the cemetery, the site of the burial, were no longer the only feasible locations for collective mourning of the dead. The site of the monument itself, the plaque listing the names of the soldiers that died, or the forest planted in their memory, or the park named after the fallen soldiers, could become sites of secular annual pilgrimage or site of commemoration. And the way the work of the dead was inscribed into landscape plays a crucial role in national movements whose project is also to nationalize the physical space, especially in contested geography. Third nationalist instrument is necrochronology. This is the creation of a national calendar that gives special significance to dates of important battles, historical events, and in short, commemorative events. If necrogeography is about engraving dead into the physical landscape, necrochronology is about stationing the work of the dead in time, and preferably in a cyclical, seasonal, or annual calendar. So the work of the dead, in other words, has both a spatial and temporal coordinates. Creating a national calendar that commemorates the date is significant because it's the most effective tool for routinization, guaranteeing that the commemorative ceremony would be repeated on a regular basis. And not less significant, calendar is often added as a supplementary layer on top of a pre-existing agricultural and or religious calendars, making the work of the dead not only part of a natural cycle of seasons, but also akin to pre-national commemorative and often religiously significant dates. So placing the modern world side by these other pre-existing dates help us adding epic, monumental dimension to the recent event and often charge it with spiritual meanings. The fourth mode of commemoration, which I refer to as speaking of the dead, pertains to the language of commemoration that takes the literary form. It uses prose and especially poetry, a modern substitute, and if you'd like, a continuation of the prayer, making the text prime sites for construction of the vocabulary, cultural tropes, metaphors, and modes of representations that are needed for the work of the dead. Now, more than Mosse, it was Paul Fussell who pioneered this field of investigation, breaking down the wall, separating literary study of war and writing from cultural history. For him, literature was the prime medium of the experience of war, not only its representation in retrospect. And the historian studying the literary text produced by the soldier or produced about him had to supply two contexts, both actual and literary in Fussell terms, to understand the war experience. So language, I would suggest, and especially poetic language, has a therapeutic dimension. In the initial raw stages, grief is an impulse that has no vocabulary of its own, and poetry and prayer, producing the cultural tropes and language and metaphors, to play a key role in the process of mourning, but crucially, they're not coming out of nowhere, and they are using existing topoi and are populated by ready-made tropes and terms. And fifth, again, and pardon that a very academic survey, the state appropriates so much of these processes, and this is connected to the fifth mode of commemoration, namely the institutionalization of memory, the creation of organization, whether these are local associations or state-sponsored agencies and departments whose task is commemoration, and this is the most discernible social marker of the culture of commemoration. If you'd like, the institutionalization of memory is to a large degree the culmination of the other four described activities of commemoration, because these institutions would often do is they would produce or preserve alongside the list of names of records of the dead, also the artistic necrographic artifacts functioning, if you'd like, as new types of museum. B, they will serve as sites of pilgrimage. These are the places that you would go to commemorate the dead. They would be places where the gathering would be done often on regular time, so it's connected to the calendar repetitively according to the logic of the necrochronology. And they would serve the sites for the ceremony or the enactment of the language of the dead in which you use the language. Now, the last feature, state sponsorship and institutionalization, is palpable in the Israeli case. Indeed, one of the defining characteristics of the Israeli culture of commemoration is the speedy appropriation of the various modes of commemoration by the new state's organs, accompanied by legislation. And I won't go into detail about the two 1950 bills, the family soldiers who perished in campaigns, and the law, the military cemetery law, that defined immediately, very quickly, the rights and the aids of the benefits of the bereaved parents, widows, and orphans, as well as the proper, unanimous, identical shape in which the graves, cemeteries, and state-owned commemoration would be designed according to. So this legislation was passed, just to clarify the chronology, less than a year after the 1949 armistice agreements, and at the same time, the law of return was passed. So you can see how fundamental it is in the making of the new state. And of course, it creates a new social fact, namely the generating state-recognized group that Israelis refer to as Mishpachat HaShchol, the bereaved family that is recognized by the state. And it is not the duty of, let's say, the Ministry of Interior or the Ministry of Labor and Social Affairs and Social Services, but the Israeli Ministry of Defense is in charge, is ensuring the welfare of these family members and to run these state-orchestrated events. And of course, I won't go into the comparison with other national cases. This is unique in the Israeli case, that the moment of the birth of the nation and the creation of the commemoration culture are almost simultaneous, which is, of course, a feature, a dominant feature. And of course, the way the Mosse was completely correct in identifying the strong linkage with Holocaust commemoration, whether in the physical dimension, the decision to create Yad Vashem in 1953 as the other side of Mount Herzl alongside the National Pantheon was part of that decision, and it's a clear conscious decision, because an earlier attempt to create Ya'ar HaKadoshim, the martyrs' forest, in the outskirts of Jerusalem was rejected. It was a clear need to put them under one roof. So turning Mount Herzl into this national Mount of Remembrance was a clear example of a top-down dynamic of state intervention. But it should be also understood as part of a bigger an ongoing Zionist attempt to create one big national pantheon that is connected with attempts of reburying notable Zionist leaders in Mount Herzl. Of course, the mountain is given the name thanks to the reburial of Herzl. And actually, if you examine the dynamic here, you will see another important layer of dimension. But interestingly so, the attempt to create the Israeli national pantheon in one place failed miserably. It failed miserably first and foremost because Israel's founding fathers themselves did not play according to that script, and every prominent leader decided that he will be buried in a different place. Chaim Weizmann in Rehovot, David Ben-Gurion in Sde Boker, and they were performing their politics through the decision on where they would be buried in many ways. But it's also, in a way, this attempt also exposed the limits of the Mapai hegemony, attempt to impose harmony on ideological cacophony within the Zionist movement. So you could see immediately that, for instance, in the famous case of the reburial of Moses Hess in the Kinneret cemetery, the labor Zionists rereading Moses Hess as their founding father, it found it important to rebury him alongside the pioneer VIPs in the picturesque kibbutz Kinneret cemetery on the shores of the Kinneret, and we have numerous other events. And also it exposes dynamics of exclusion that are connected to some of the things that Adi Armon mentioned, and then most notably the exclusion of the revisionist right from the national pantheon. It would be one of the longest, if probably the longest campaign, 13 years that it took the revisionist movement since 1951 until July 64 to bring to final rest in Jerusalem the remains of Vladimir Ze'ev Jabotinsky. It exposed how politically fraught was the attempt of constructing a new national pantheon. The country needs living Jews, not bones, David Ben-Gurion declared in one of the endless cabinet meetings debating the proposal. And it was actually for a decade that his sole opinion objecting the proposal was a determining factor. It would wait until Levi Eshkol's prime ministership that he would, Jabotinsky will be reburied in Mount Herzl. Moreover, many times when you see the creation of historical intersectionality connecting Holocaust memory with the 1948 war, it would not happen from the state organs, but from a bottom-up development. And the most important and most illustrative case is the case of Kibbutz Yad Mordechai, the kibbutz itself naming itself. It's a commemorative act in the name of Mordechai Anilevich, the leader of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, was Hashomer HaTzair Kibbutz. It was the decision of the kibbutz members to create a museum there. It was the decision of the kibbutz members also to commission Natan Rapaport to create this famous statue of Anilevich. And this is a very important element, and I brought this photo on purpose because part of what makes this unique is not only the statue itself, but also its background. The kibbutz suffered, was at the heart of battle scenes during the 1948 war and withstood several attacks of the Egyptian army, and was a decision to leave the kibbutz water tower that was scarred in the 1948 war as the background to Anilevich's tomb, and if you'd like, the necrography of the site is not about the statue itself, separated from its very clear clear background. And of course, the decision to bring Natan Rapaport is connected to the fact that this is, of course, the Jewish Polish sculptor that prepared the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising monument in Warsaw 2 years earlier. And as we now know, thanks to the work of James Young, actually Natan Rapaport used a kibbutznik living in Paris as a model for Mordechai Anilevich because it was looking, a clear Mossian intervention is needed here, a muscular Jew that would represent the Warsaw Ghetto fighting. And there are other examples that I will skip due to the brevity in time. Even in the first Israeli feature movie ever, Hill 24 Doesn't Answer, that deals that in a very interesting scene describes the war in the Egyptian front in the southern front, in which the actor, the prototypical Sabra, discovers that actually he's not fighting an Egyptian officer, but an SS officer that joined the Egyptian troops, and it ends with him killing the SS officer after he has the Hitler salute. And so on. I will steal 2 minutes and just to say a few words about the language of the dead, and also posing the big question whether in the Israeli case, the language of Israeli bereavement was forged by the war veterans themselves. So the complicated answer, to paraphrase Shimon Peres, is yes and no. In the one hand, it is hard to downplay the importance of texts such as Chaim Guri's Hine Mutalot Gufotenu, Here Lie Our Bodies, written to commemorate the Haganah fighters that were killed by Arab irregulars in the early stages of the war, and its canonical position in Israeli commemoration culture. The poem's rhetorical power, using the collective first person, see, we did not betray, the way it seeks to speak on behalf of the dead, affirming the ideal of individual sacrifice for the collective good, as well as the tragic circumstances and the outcomes of the battle, can explain, at least in part, why it was chosen to be included in numerous Izkor booklets and anthologies and endless commemorative ceremonies. On the other hand, catchphrases such as the silver platter were the brainchild of Natan Alterman, a generation older than the native-born Guri, and not a member of the so-called 1948 generation authors, and whose literary career began in the Palmach and the publications in Yalkut HaRo'im. So in a sense, a lot of the Israeli commemoration culture used the language of the Alterman poetry, and especially important in that respect is his trope of the living dead. This literary scholars know it very well. It was a trope, well-known trope in Hebrew literature, often symbolizing old Judaism, that Alterman turned into a ghostly presence of the human, of the fighter that continues walking, despite the fact that he carries a bullet in his heart. This was used much more than the writings of the veterans themselves. Even more often, when you look at the writings of the veterans, you will see, you can read it against the grain as an attempt to fight the Alterman epic, heroic language. And I won't go into the example of Ein Hillel due to brevity of time, but maybe the most important and most famous example is the early stages of Yehuda Amichai's career, when he published his minimalist anti-epic poem Rain in the Battlefield in 1955, it became, if you like, a staple of a new poetic sensibility that is written against Alterman. And I read it very quickly. It's really short. In memory of Dickey, the sentence is part of the poem. Rain falls on the faces of my comrades, on the face of my living comrades, who cover their heads with a blanket, and on the faces of my dead comrades who do not cover it anymore. Now, I mention it because the poem was immediately recognized as offering a blatant antithesis to the Alterman silver platter and the Chaim Guri, Here Lies Our Body. It was unmistakably a dedication song written in memory of his company commander, Chaim Laxberg, and of course he's using the famous Israeli nickname that is a trademark of the Palmachnik language of camaraderie and homage. But this was not a poem that was canonized and memorized. So I'll finish by saying, so what actually happened? And this is where I think the 2 points of departure from Mosse's argument are very clear. The culture of commemoration in Israel was basically produced in the first years by the parents, both the mothers and the fathers. And the creation of the fallen Israeli soldier as Haben, as the son, is not coincidental. If you'd like, the two key actors here are Reuven Grossman, later renamed Avinoam. His Avinoam literally means in Hebrew the father of Noam. He's a Chicago-born Jewish educationalist that moved to Palestine in 1929, and after his son died, became the key member engine behind creating these anthologies, excerpts of dead soldiers, approaching David Ben-Gurion that will give him the endorsement and the support of the state to continue this project. And the second famous example is Rivka Guber, that was again born in Novosibirsk in the Ukraine and immigrated to Palestine in the 1920s, that lost two sons, Ephraim and Tzvi, during the 1948 war, and she started commemorating the death of her sons through literature. And more important, she began using the story from the book of Maccabean 2 on Hannah and her 7 sons to express grief and sacrifice as a mother. And subsequently, she became known as Em Habanim, mother of the son, was commemorated herself, and then involved in Holocaust commemoration in Israel. It was very important for David Ben-Gurion to see her and present her as a role model and symbol of voluntarism and devotion. She was not only awarded the Israeli Prize in 1967, but when Menachem Begin was invited Guber to join the Israeli delegation that traveled to Washington, D.C. for the signing of the peace treaty with Egypt. Thank you so much.